The sound of a gunshot is nothing like what they show in the movies. Elaine Prudhomme knew that better than most people in this world, better than the screenwriters, better than the stunt coordinators, better than the weekend hunters who thought they understood violence because they'd once dropped a buck at 300 yards. She knew what it sounded like when a bullet punched through body armor. She knew what it smelled like when a building stopped being a building and started being a tomb. She knew all of it. She just didn't talk about it, which was why, on a Tuesday morning in September, when Dr. Kenneth Holt pointed his finger 2 inches from her face and told her she was the most useless new hire he'd seen in 20 years of practice, Elaine said nothing. She looked at the floor. She nodded once. She went back to taking inventory of the supply cabinet. Ridgecrest Family Medical Center wasn't a war zone. It was a mid-sized clinic in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, staffed by 12 nurses, 4 physicians, 1 notoriously difficult office manager, and 1 medical assistant named Elaine Prudhomme, who had arrived 6 weeks ago with a quiet manner, a slight frame, and credentials that were technically impressive but emotionally forgettable. Nobody had looked twice at her application. The clinic needed warm bodies. She was warm. She had a body. Done. Dr. Holt was not a bad doctor. He was a precise one, which in his mind was the same thing. He ran his department the way a man runs a ship he believes will sink without him. Loudly, constantly, with the implication that everyone around him was one careless breath away from catastrophe. His voice carried. His opinions carried further. "The Whitmore chart," he said, appearing in the doorway of the supply room without knocking. He never knocked. "Tell me you pulled the Whitmore chart." Elaine turned. "It's on your desk." "I flagged the medication interactions on page 3. He stared at her. "I didn't ask you to flag anything." "No, sir." "Then, why did you?" "The patient is on warfarin," she said. The new prescription would have counteracted it. There was a beat of silence. Holt's jaw tightened. He was the kind of man who found it deeply uncomfortable when people were correct without his permission. "Next time," he said slowly, "you bring it to me before you touch the chart." "Of course!" He left. Elaine went back to counting gauze pads. Across the hallway, she could hear Patrice Odom, the office manager, laughing about something with the front desk staff. Patrice was good-natured and loud and had formed opinions about everyone within their first 48 hours of employment. Her opinion of Elaine was that the woman was sweet but forgettable. Like vanilla, Patrice had once said, not realizing Elaine was around the corner. Just vanilla. Elaine had almost smiled at that. She'd been called a lot of things in her life. Vanilla was a new one. She'd been called a ghost by a colonel in Kandahar who'd watched her disappear into a crowd of 200 people and emerge 40 minutes later with the intelligence they'd spent 3 weeks trying to acquire. She'd been called terrifying by a CIA field trainer who'd assessed her combat scores and gone very quiet. She'd been called the best trauma medic this unit has ever had by a man whose name she couldn't repeat even now, bleeding from a through and through in a drainage ditch outside a city that officially didn't exist. But vanilla, that was new. The thing about Elaine Prudhomme was that she had chosen this. Not the finger-pointing, not the condescension, those she merely tolerated, but the invisibility itself, the deliberate ordinariness of her days, the way she wore her hair pulled back too tightly, and her scrubs one size too large, and her shoes sensible to the point of being almost a statement. All of that was intentional. She was 31 years old, and she had spent 9 of those years being extraordinary, in ways that cost more than most people were ever asked to pay. She wanted for a while to simply exist, to do small work carefully, to be nobody. She was very good at being nobody. It helped that her coworkers weren't particularly curious people. Brennan, the afternoon nurse, talked about his fantasy football league with the fervor of a man who had found religion and wanted to share it. Suki, the pediatric assistant, was engaged and planning a wedding and had recently discovered that every conversation could be redirected towards centerpieces. The youngest physician, Dr. Anaya Roth, was too busy being competent and slightly overwhelmed to notice much about anyone who wasn't directly in front of her with a problem. They were decent people. Elaine liked them, in the careful way she liked most people, at a distance that felt like warmth but never quite became intimacy. The one person who had come close to seeing her was a patient named Clifford Staines. He was 73, a retired Army sergeant, and he came in every 6 weeks for blood pressure management. The third time they'd crossed paths, he'd looked at her for a long moment while she was checking his pulse. 11 Bravo? He'd asked. 68 Whiskey, she'd said. Combat medic. Formerly. Long time ago. He'd nodded like that hen answered something. He never asked anything else. She appreciated him enormously. The morning of October 4th started like all the other mornings, which was how Elaine preferred her mornings. She arrived at 7:45, 15 minutes before her shift. She reviewed the overnight notes. She checked the waiting room. She restocked Bay 3, which Brennan reliably left low on saline. She made a pot of coffee and drank half of it standing at the window, watching the parking lot fill. At 9:10, Dr. Holt told her she'd entered a billing code wrong. At 9:40, Patrice mentioned to someone, in a voice that traveled, that Elaine needed to speak up more in morning huddle. At 10:15, a man came through the front door. Elaine noticed him first because that was what she did, and she could not stop doing it, even when she wanted to. She noticed things. The way he walked, careful, deliberate, the kind of careful that isn't calm but is controlling itself. The jacket, heavier than the weather required, with a rigidity around the left side that suggested structure underneath. The eyes, moving cataloging, not reading the signs or looking for a reception desk. Looking at people. He was looking for someone specific. She went back to typing. She kept him in her peripheral vision. He approached the front desk and smiled at the receptionist, a young woman named Becca, who smiled back because that was Becca's factory setting. He asked something. Becca answered, pointing toward the back hallway. The man thanked her. He walked with purpose now, less performance of casualness, toward the wing where the exam rooms were. Elaine set down her pen. The patient in room 6 was a 64-year-old man named Victor Aldis. He had come in 3 days ago with chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal. He was being discharged today. Victor Aldis was the kind of man who seemed unremarkable until you looked at his intake form carefully, which Elaine had because she always did. The address was a P.O. box. The emergency contact was listed as NCA. He paid in cash. He had a surgical scar on his right forearm that was not the result of any standard medical procedure she'd been trained to recognize. She didn't know who Victor Aldis was, but she knew what he was, or had been. She also knew that the man who just walked past the front desk was not here for a checkup. She moved toward the hallway. She did it the way she did most things. Without hurry, without announcement, with the unassuming steadiness of someone retrieving a file. Nobody looked up. Nobody would remember she'd moved at all. In the hallway, she could see the man's jacket ahead of her. He was nearly at room 6. She was 20 feet behind him. She picked up a clipboard from the wall rack and kept walking. The man pushed open the door to room 6. What happened in the next 4 seconds was something she processed the way she had been trained to process it. Not as a sequence of panicked decisions, but as a series of problems with solutions. The man's right hand went into his jacket. Victor Aldis, who was sitting on the exam table still in his paper gown, saw the hand go in and immediately began to move. Neither of them had yet registered her presence in the doorway. She stepped into the room, caught the man's right wrist with both hands, and redirected the momentum he'd already committed to. He was larger than her by 70 pounds. That did not matter. What mattered was the angle of his elbow, and she had the angle, and she used it. He went into the wall. The weapon, a compact semi-automatic she didn't have time to identify, clattered across the linoleum. Victor Aldis stared at her from the exam table. The man recovered faster than she expected. Trained, then. She adjusted. He came at her low and she let him get close enough, and then she was behind him, and the outcome of that was not pleasant for him, but was very fast. He went down. He stayed down. Elaine picked up the weapon, dropped the magazine, cleared the chamber, and set both on the counter above the sink. She picked up the exam room phone and called the front desk. "Becca," she said, keeping her voice level. "I need you to call 911 and tell them we have a situation in room 6. Don't let anyone into the back hallway. Stay at your desk." A pause. "Elaine, is everything?" I also need you to find Dr. Roth and ask her to come to the back, calmly, when you can. Thank you. She hung up. Victor Aldous was still staring at her. His paper gown crinkled slightly as he shifted. You're going to have questions, she said. Yeah, he said. His voice was rough. Starting with who in God's name are you? I'm your medical assistant, she said. But I used to be other things. He looked at the man on the floor. He looked back at her. I can see that. The police arrived in 7 minutes, which was good time for Dunmore. She met the first officer, a young woman named Castillo, who had the tightly wound energy of someone who had not seen a great deal, professionally, and was now seeing a great deal, in the hallway, and explained the situation in clear, factual sentences. Castillo wrote everything down. Her partner, an older man named Dietz, looked at the man on the floor and then at Elaine and seemed to make some kind of internal calculation. Ma'am, he said, do you have any training? I was a military medic, she said, and some other things after that. I can give you a full statement at the station if that's helpful. Dietz looked at Castillo. Castillo looked at her notepad. That would be very helpful, she said. Dr. Holt arrived in the hallway approximately 90 seconds after the police. He took in the scene. Officers, man in restraints, Elaine standing against the wall with her arms folded, and processed it with this expression of a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in a room and was experiencing a new sensation. Prudhomme, he said. What in the... There was a threat to a patient, she said. It's been neutralized. Dr. Roth is with Mr. Aldous in room 6. He's unharmed. Holt looked at the restrained man on the floor. He looked at Elaine. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Is the clinic? The clinic is fine, she said. Becca handled the lockdown well. You might want to check on her. He stood there for a moment, and she watched something shift in his face. Not quite humility, but the first seismic tremor of it. The realization that the person he had spent 6 weeks instructing on how to properly flag billing codes had just handled something he had no framework for at all. He went to find Becca. The rest of the morning was paperwork. The police were thorough. There were calls made to people who didn't announce their agencies or explain their jurisdictions. Victor Aldous was quietly transferred to a facility that wasn't listed on any public health directory. The man from room 6 was taken away in a vehicle that didn't have standard police markings. Elaine gave her statement twice, answered every question directly, and signed 3 forms she was confident she could not discuss afterward. Patrice came to find her at noon. Elaine. She stopped in the break room doorway. She had the look of a woman who had been reprocessing information and had not yet caught up. Are you okay? I'm fine. Do you want coffee? Yes. No. Elaine, what? Who are you? Elaine looked at her for a moment. I'm Vanilla, she said simply. Patrice did not laugh. But she sat down and she accepted the coffee, and for several minutes she was quieter than Elaine had ever heard her. The call came in at 2:17 in the afternoon, while Elaine was updating patient charts at the nurse's station. She didn't know it was coming. She'd told herself, years ago, that she had no real expectation of ever hearing from that part of her life again. She had been careful about separation. She had been deliberate of finding you. But things have a way of finding you. Becca leaned around the reception window. Elaine, there are some people here asking for you. She had been expecting, dimly, a follow-up from one of the agencies, a debriefer, maybe a second round of statements. She was not expecting what she saw when she walked into the lobby. There were 7 of them. They were dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, jackets, one in a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. But they stood the way people who have been military stand, even when they are trying not to. Upright in a particular way, occupying space with intention. Their eyes moved. She stopped walking. She knew these people. She knew them the way you know the people who have carried you out of burning buildings, who have made decisions in fractions of seconds that meant you got to go home. You don't forget those people. You don't forget them, even when you're trying to forget everything else. The one in front was a woman named Sergeant Blythe Harrow, though Elaine had known her as Harrow. For so long, the first name felt slightly fictional. She was 40, with the kind of face that had been weathered by both sun and responsibility, and she was standing in the lobby of Ridgecrest Family Medical Center, looking at Elaine Prudhomme with an expression that was doing several things at once. Beside Harrow was Kowalski, who'd had a beard the entire time Elaine had known him and still did, and Tremaine, who she'd kept alive with her own hands on a hillside in a country that officially had no American presence, and others. Faces that lived in a part of her memory she had sealed and labeled and put in a room she didn't visit. She stood still. Harrow walked toward her. She stopped about 3 feet away. She looked at Elaine for a moment. The scrubs, the sensible shoes, the hair pulled back too tight, and something in her expression cracked open just slightly at the edges. "We heard what happened this morning," Harrow said. "It was a minor incident," Elaine said. Her voice was steady. "Handled. I know it was handled. That's why we're here." Elaine says anything. Harrow turned slightly and looked back at the 6 people standing in the lobby. Then she turned back to Elaine. "We've been trying to find you for 2 years. You disappeared pretty thoroughly." "I know how to disappear." "Yeah," Harrow said. "You really do." A pause. "You also know how to walk into a room with an armed man and come out the only one standing, apparently." He was overcommitted in his approach. It wasn't complicated. Kowalski made a sound that might have been a laugh. Harrow took a breath. "Elaine, we came to say something. As a unit. Because there was a long time when we didn't get to say it, and then you were gone, and we should have said it a long time ago." Elaine felt something shift somewhere behind her sternum. She kept her face still. "You saved every person standing in this lobby," Harrow said. "Some of them more than once. Tremaine twice. Kowalski." She glanced at him. "Let's not even start with Kowalski. 3 times," Kowalski said, "but I maintain that 2 of them were preventable on my end. You kept going when anyone else would have quit." Harrow continued. "You made decisions that nobody else could have made, in conditions nobody should have survived, and you never asked for anything in return. Not recognition, not rank, not credit." She paused. You just took care of people. That's all you ever did. You took care of everyone." The lobby was very quiet. Through the reception window, Elaine could see Becca watching. Patrice had appeared in the hallway and stopped. Elaine said, "I was doing my job." "No," Harrow said. "You were doing more than your job. You were doing what you are." She glanced around at the nurses' station, the waiting chairs, the fluorescent lights, the stack of insurance forms on the counter. "You're still doing it. Different theater, same mission." There was a pause. Then Harrow stepped back. She looked at the 6 people behind her and gave the smallest of nods. They came to attention. In the lobby of a mid-sized family medical clinic in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, on an unremarkable Thursday in October, 7 people in civilian clothes stood at attention and rendered a salute to a woman in pale blue scrubs who was standing at a nurse's station with a pen still in her hand. Elaine Prudhomme stood very still. She had been saluted before, in the formal sense. She had received commendations and citations and handshakes from men with stars on their collars, but those had been events, ceremonies, processed through the part of her brain that categorized and filed and moved on. This was different. These were the people who had been there, the ones who knew what the commendations didn't say, who knew what had been required, who had been in the room, or in the ditch, or on the hillside, and knew exactly what had been given and what it had cost. She pressed her lips together once. She put down the pen. She stood straight and she returned the salute. Behind the reception window, Becca had both hands over her mouth. Patrice, in the hallway, was completely still. Brennan, who had come out of the break room at some point without anyone noticing, was standing against the wall with the expression of a man who had just understood something he hadn't known he was missing. Dr. Holt was there too. Nobody had told him to be there. He had simply emerged from his office at some point and had not left. He was standing slightly apart from the others, and he was watching Elaine with an expression that was not quite the face of a man who had done something wrong, but was perhaps the face of a man who was standing at the beginning of understanding that. The Lou said. Harrow extended her hand. Elaine took it. "We've always been proud of you. We just needed you to know." Elaine nodded once. Carefully. Like someone handling something fragile. "We heard you've got good coffee here," Kowalski said from behind Harrow. Elaine looked at him. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "It's decent," she said. Decent was always good enough for us. They stayed for an hour. They crowded into the break room and drank the coffee, and Tremaine showed someone on his phone a picture of his daughter, who was 4 now, and apparently in the process of staging what he had called a coup of the household. Harrow sat across from Elaine and they talked, quietly, at the corner of the table. About nothing important, and several things that were. Elaine learned that Kowalski had gotten a dog. She learned that 2 of the people in that room had gotten out, and that 2 others were still in and moving up. She learned that the world she'd left behind had kept moving without her, as the world always did, and had not entirely forgotten her either. At 3:30, they gathered themselves to go. Harrow was last to the door. She turned back once. "You know," she said. "You don't have to hide here." Elaine considered that. "I'm not hiding," she said. "I'm choosing." Harrow looked at her for a moment, then she nodded. "Okay," she said. "That's different." "Yes," Elaine said. "It is." After they left, the clinic was very quiet for a while. Not the awkward quiet of people avoiding something, but the quieter quiet of people sitting with something they'd just witnessed and weren't sure how to name. Dr. Holt walked past the nurse's station at 3:45. He stopped. He stood there for a moment, with his hands in the pockets of his white coat, and he looked at the surface of the desk and then up at her. "Prudhomme," he said. Dr. Holt. A long pause. He seemed to be working on something internally. Some architecture that was taking significant effort to construct. "The Whitmore chart," he said. "The flag you put on it. You were right to flag it." Elaine looked at him. "I should have said that last week," he said, "when it happened." She held his gaze for a moment, not to make him uncomfortable, but because she wanted to see if he would hold it. He did. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and walked away. Elaine turned back to the charts. She picked up her pen. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle now, the way it did in October in Pennsylvania, amber and slightly melancholy, the kind of light that made ordinary things look like they meant something. She thought about what Harrow had said. "You don't have to hide here," and her own answer. "I'm not hiding. I'm choosing." She had meant it. She had spent 9 years at the sharpest possible edge of things, making decisions in the dark that nobody would ever hear about, carrying weight that had no official name. She had done it willingly. She had done it well. And she had come here, to this ordinary clinic, with its ordinary rhythms, and its difficult doctor, and its vanilla label, and its waiting room full of people who needed simple, consistent, careful attention. And she had chosen it. Not as a hiding place, as a place. She was not done being extraordinary. She had simply decided what form it would take from here. Becca appeared at the window. She had the slightly stunned look she'd been wearing since approximately 2 o'clock. "Elaine," she said. "One more patient before close." "Room 4. I'll be right there," Elaine said. She capped her pen. She straightened the stack of charts up. She walked down the hallway toward room 4, in her sensible shoes and her slightly too large scrubs, and she knocked once before she entered, because that was how she did things. The patient was a young woman, early 20s, holding a sleeping toddler and looking exhausted in the specific way that young mothers in waiting rooms look exhausted, like they've been underwater for months and have stopped expecting the surface. Elaine sat down across from her. She didn't rush. She had never rushed with patients, even when the clinic was backed up and Dr. Holt's impatience was a pressure system. Moving through the hallways. "Hi," Elaine said. "Tell me what's going on today." The woman looked up, and something in her expression shifted, some small, involuntary release at being asked that question by someone who was clearly prepared to listen to the full answer. That was the thing nobody ever put in the commendations. The real work. The sustained, quiet, daily work of paying attention to people who needed someone to pay attention to them. It didn't make headlines. It didn't get salutes, usually. It just happened, day after day, in ordinary rooms with fluorescent lights, and it mattered anyway. Maybe it mattered most. Elaine Prudhomme, who had been called a ghost and a weapon, and the best medic any of them had ever served with, pulled her chair a little closer and listened.